Hi there, I'm Dominic from Mountea and welcome. In this video, I would like to showcase a new update to the interaction system which comes with some major changes. So, with no further ado, let's get started. As any good tutorial for Unreal Engine, let's start with making an example project. In this video, I will showcase the Unreal Engine 5.4 as is the latest version of Unreal Engine, but the same applies to every single supported Unreal Engine version for all plugins. So let's create a new project. For the new project, I highly recommend using the third-person example because it contains some content which is expected to be there. But for this example, I will show you how to make it work even with the blank project and how to add the required components later on. So let's select Blend, Blueprint, and let's give it a name. And hit create. While the project is being compiled behind the scenes, let's install the plugin to the engine itself. In your vault, simply search for Mountea, and depending on how many plugins you get, there are your results. So I will install the interaction plugin, simply select engine, select in 5.4 and hit install. And that's how to install the plugin. Once headers are compiled and your project is opened, you will be greeted by this empty landscape. Don't worry about it, and let's head first to the plugins section. If you don't see plugins here, simply go to Window, and here you should be able to see, edit plugins, and here open the Mountea Framework tab, check the plugin, and hit restart. See you in a second. Welcome back. This is the screen you see when the project restarts. This pop-up window will appear just and only once for every version. And here is detailed changelog with all versions going back. And there are some buttons. You can leave a review. You can support our work, join Discord. You can take a look at our friends at Unreal Bucket, or simply close the window. So let's close the window and let's take a look at stuff that has been added by the plugin. So first things first, let's go to project settings, scroll down, and here you should see Mountea Framework. Click the interaction system, and here are your project settings. Those settings are unique for every single project, and this is all the stuff you need to set up to make sure your interaction system works. If you have no idea what to fit into those values, don't worry, the plugin comes with some default values. Just simply select the ones that pop out, and this should be all you need to set up in order to make the interaction work in terms of the project settings. Good. We have the project settings finished, so let's go back to the level, go to the content browser, and here you can have your visualization of all your folders. Let's go to plugins, and here you should search for Actor Interaction, if I could type. So maybe this one, right click, show in folder view. And here is, let's make it a little bit larger so you can see it much better. So here is Mountea Interaction System content. This is where all the interaction system stuff is located, the stuff which comes with the plugin. So here is the folder structure of the plugin, which we have just downloaded. There's a lot of folders. Don't be scared of that. Right now, we are going to take a look at the example folder, which comes with the example level. So let's open the example level and take a look what's inside. This looks a little bit empty. Don't worry about it. This is because we are using right now a blank project. If you want to fix this example level and some compilation errors, which might happen in this character blueprint, let's take a look and open it. As you can see here, I have a compilation error. Don't worry about it, I will show you right now how to fix this issue. The solution for this issue is actually very simple. All you need to do is go to the Add button, its feature or content tag, and select third person and hit Add to project. Once this is done, You might need to restart the editor, but then just open the example file again, and you can see we have a level. And if we open the character, it's going to take a second. We have no compilation errors. So you can see all our blueprint nodes are working, and we can start taking a look at the example itself. And before we take a look at the example itself, let me quickly explain why this doesn't work. This is simply because it requires a third person example. First of all, it requires this level because this is the example level from the first person template. So we need the walls and stuff, everything, including the mesh itself. And the reason why the character wasn't working is because this character is utilizing the enhanced input system, and it's using the inputs which comes with the third person. As you can see in the tooltip, in the first person template is the IMC default context mapping. So this is the reason why it doesn't work. And if you add the third person template, it works. So just add that and maybe save the project, restart the project, and then it should all work just fine. So now we can actually start taking a look at the plugin. And what does the plugin need to actually work? It is one little thing that needs to be set up on your side, because the plugin cannot import your project with custom collision setup, unfortunately. So you need to go to your project, go to collision, which is under C, collision here, and you need to add two new things. First is an object channel, let's call it overlap, and set everything to ignore and accept. Then you need to add new trace channel, and let's call it trace, and set everything again to ignore, accept. And this is all the stuff you need to do on the collision side to make this project work. And why is collision needed to make this project work? It's actually quite simple. This project is using Unreal Engine built-in collision system to determine if interactor is actually interacting or can interact with the interactable actor. So unless you want to use some built-in collision channels, which is also possible, but it is common and good practice to create your own just for the interaction sake, which won't affect any other part of the game. And how do you actually utilize those collisions? Let's take a look at the plugin again. So here we have our character who is the interactor. That means he is doing all the interaction as the player. So let's open the blueprint. And as you can see on the left side, there are two components, trace and overlap. Let's start with the trace. That's the more common thing that you know from video games. How does it work? Actually, I can show you quite easily here. Here is our player character. And imagine the trace interaction to be basically a laser firing from his eyes, even though this character doesn't have any eyes. And there is an invisible trace, which you can make visible by simply debug settings, but take a look at that later on. So the trace works as an invisible ray, which hits multiple objects in front of this. It's using some settings which are in the required part. And here is the collision channel by which it checks against other actors. So if it hits based on the trace collision, which I just said here, it will only work with other actors who have any component with the same collision channel. So it will completely ignore walls, it will ignore everything, it will simply just go straight through everything until it finds some interactable object, or it runs out of the interaction range, which can be set up here. Also, here you can have some required options. The trace type defines how precise the tracing is. By the way, if you hover over any variable in here, you will get some tooltip, which will definitely explain much better than I will. What does it do? So you have a trace type, tick interval, which defines how often the tracing is tracing out of this character's eyes. Then you have how far the trace can reach. And if you're using a loose way of tracing, how big the shape of the tracing actually is. So if you're using loose, it's going to not cast a single ray out of his eyes. It's going to basically cast a cube, a simple box. And the box will move, and size of the box is defined by this trace shape half size. Then we have an option to use custom trace transform. This is very important thing because by default, the plugin is using Unreal Engine's default eyes height, which every single character has defined in the class itself. But you can override it. You can use the custom star transform. In this case, this character is using that. And in the event graph, you can see here we have a trace on traced event, which is the trace component is calling. And we have the tracing start component. And we are feeding set custom trace start to the component. What does it mean? Imagine that we have here is trace start. So this defines where the trace component will trace from. So I can move it actually inside the character's head. I can move it a little bit further ahead. And this will define where the invisible ray will shoot from. You can actually don't need to use a custom component. You can use any different values. You can actually use a bone from the mesh. All good. All you need to define is the trace start. It has to be transformed because the tracing is using rotation as well. But I would say this is the easiest way, and it comes with the plugin itself, so feel free to use it. And let's go back to the trace. So collision channel already explained. And here we have the default state. Default state defines what state this interactor has when his owning actor, in this case the character, starts the game, so the begin play. If it's awake, it will be starting tracing all over the place. If it's asleep, it won't trace. If it's suppressed, it won't trace either. If it's interacting, well, this state is not enabled. If I try to click it, you see there is some warning and it sets back to awake. And then we can have it disabled, and this disabled state means that it won't do anything. It will ignore everything, no tracing will happen, but it can be enabled again. Now, there is one very important new feature which is new to the version 4, and that's safety trace. The safety trace works quite easily. Imagine that you have an actor, your player, who comes to NPC, and you want to interact with the NPC. But the NPC is behind a wall. Actually, I don't need to explain like this because it's hard to visualize. I can go, let me compile and save. I can go to the level and show you. Here is our NPC. As you can see, this NPC has a collision shape which is clipping through the wall. Let me quickly move those other dudes away so they are not in the way. And in a second, I will show you why is this safety trace a very important feature. Before I do that though, I need to slightly update the interactable on this character too. So I will use the hold. I will scroll a little down here to, here to required, and I will choose trace. And this should be all you need to do in order to make it work. So let's test it out. Let's save the level and let's hit play. As you can see, now if I hit F8, which will depossess me, you can see there is text above the player. I will explain that in a second. And here is the debug spheres. The blue one is shown where the trace starts, and the red one shows where the trace ends. There will be a green one as well, and the green one shows where the trace actually hit something that could be interacted with. And what actually is this text above the player? The plugin comes with this character, and it has its own text render. And this value, if I go back to the class, is onTick, feed it from the active component, and if debug mode is enabled, it shows or hides the text render based on the setting, and then it transforms the component to string. This is the find function in the interactor interface, and it provides some debug information, and it simply shows this information to you. So if you take a look, you can see that we are not interacting with anything. The state is awake. We are using game trace channel 2, which is trace channel in our case, that we are using some gameplay tech, that we're using a loose type trace, we are tracing in this interval, and we are using this trace range. All the information that you can see in here should be shown in here. So now if I possess the player again, we can take a look at this NPC who is behind the wall. So if I go here and try to interact with him, you can see that there is obstacle found in array direction. What does it mean? So it will be best explained by this debug info. The green sphere is where the trace component collided with some collision which is enabled for the actor with the interactable. So that would mean if there is green, we could possibly interact with that thing. However, if we have enabled the safety trace, it will perform additional trace. You can see this simple purple, to make it more visible, this purple trace in here from the trace location to location of the owner of the component. And if that is being blocked by something, in this case the wall, it will say, hey, you cannot interact with this because there is something in the way. This safety trace should use a different collision channel than the trace component in order to make the safety trace valid. Because if you're using the same collision channel, then it will always say, hey, it's valid. So using this approach, this two-step verification, basically, you are sure that you cannot interact with object which is behind the wall. So let me quickly process again, and let's go behind the wall and take a look at the NPC. And as you can see, because now there is nothing in the way, the NPC actually can be interacted with. There is nothing in the way, and there is now a wall. Nothing, a wall. You can see this actually, if I move the head slightly to the left, nothing, to the right, wall. Nothing, wall. So this is how the new feature safety trace works, and you can always disable the feature. Let me hit escape, and let's take a look on the player, in the example, in the character, and in the trace component, in the safety trace setup. You can say none. And if you use none, it will not perform the safety trace, and you'll be able to interact with everything, even though it might be through walls. There is actually one additional feature that has been added, and that's tags. So let me... Oh, this is something that you don't need to worry about. because you can actually specify your own text here. It's using Unreal Engine native gameplay text. And if you want to, there is a link in the description where you can download the text from the GitHub repository, and you will not get this error message. And what this is for? Well, this is for additional filtering, because you can specify a tag of this player, and you can specify a tag on any interactable. Let's go to the hold. Let's scroll down a little bit, and in optional here, interactable compatible tags, and here you can specify multiple tags, and if those tags on the player are present, if at least one of those tags is present on the player can interact with the NPC. What is this good for? Well, it's very simple. Imagine that you have, for instance, a quest system, and the quest system gives gameplay text to NPCs, like can interact, cannot interact, or I don't know, interactable NPC. And in some cases, you want to disable this option, but disable it only during the period of the quest, or simply you want only enable this interaction to specific players if you have a multiplayer session, or enable only to NPCs. So rather than creating different collision channels for every single combination, you can dynamically swap the compatible text on the NPC, and that will filter out the interactors who are not compatible with this list of tags. So I can actually add all of those, and if I now hit play and go to the NPC which worked a few seconds before, it will work still. Don't worry about it. That's because this player itself, if I go to the trace and to optional and tags and give it, for instance, this tag, you can see there is issues that the player has not compatible tags with the NPC. And this works the way the component on the player is searching for the tags in the NPC, but only if there is at least one field in the player. So I will definitely suggest to use some default values like player, NPC, and stuff like this for default values in your project, and then dynamically add or remove from interactable components. So let's hit escape to get rid of those silly messages, and let's take a look at another feature. So let's open the player again, and in the trace you have a list of ignored actors. That means you can actually specify what actors to ignore. And now we are getting to the debug mode. If I uncheck it, compile, and hit play, you should not see any tracing or text above the player. This debug mode will only work in editor mode. That means in Unreal Engine editor and in development builds. No matter the settings, if you keep it everything to true, it won't affect shipping builds. So don't worry about this. This is just for your debugging sessions. And that's basically all for the character. Let's take a look at the interactable NPC. Let's open the NPC, and as you can see, there is actually nothing. So how to make this NPC work, and more importantly, how to make it work in multiplayer. Because one feature that has been added in this version 4 is multiplayer support. If we go back to the character, the player character, and go to class defaults and search for a replicate, we can see the replication is set to replicate. This is in the class defaults. If you don't want to see all those additional details, all you need to do is to make everything smaller, and here is the replication, and that replication applies to the actor, not to other components. Because here is component replication, but we don't care about this right now. We only care about the actor replication. So the player actor replicates. That means this is compatible with multiplayer. And if you go to the trace component and take a look at component replication, it's also set to replicate. This is very, very important thing, because if you don't set this component replicate to true, it will not work in multiplayer. Don't worry, by default it's set to true, and if you don't have multiplayer game, it will not affect the single player experience. Now, let's take a look at one important thing in the player, and that is how to actually start the interaction. So how do you start the interaction? It's a little bit more complicated than simple answer. It all starts in begin play. In begin play, what do? We take a look if we can execute cosmetic events. That means we are either in single player mode or we are client in multiplayer mode. Then we get the controller and register the defaults from the third person template mapping, which contains the movement, camera moving, and everything. You don't need to do this. If you have your own, either fill it here or delete it and use your own logic. Then we get the system settings. That's why it's important to fill that data in the beginning. We get the interaction input mapping, which is the one which comes with the plugin, and we load it. Once it is loaded, we add this mapping context to the player controller. This will enable something what is inside the mapping itself. So let's take a look at the mapping. It's an input folder, and here is the input mapping context interact. Let's open it, and here there are two mappings. Interact with F key and interact controller with gamepad face button. In case of Xbox controller, it's the A button. Those two mappings are also, as you have most likely noticed, inside this input folder. Here, interact and interact controller, and both of them have basically the same values. You don't need to use both of them. You can use only one of them. This is just to make your life easier when dynamically switching textures for different input types. I will show you that later on. So let's go back to the mapping. And as you can see, both of them have the same triggers. Pressed and released. And this is how you start the interaction or stop. So back to the character. Let's go a little bit down here and take a look. Here is a move. Here we go. So here is interact and interact controller, and they are calling to process interaction input function, which is specific to this blueprint class. Don't worry, you don't need to have this blueprint class in your project. Let's take a look what's inside. We are taking the input action, which is being fed from the enhanced input action. It gives the input action itself, which is either the interact or the controller, and the value, whether it is pressed or released. Here, there is some dynamic switching just for this specific class, and we are asking if we can actually interact. If we can interact, we ask to consume the input using the input action. This will give the context of the input action to the interactable component, which then handles this information using for the UI. Then we take a look if value is true or false, whether it's pressed or released. If it is pressed, we call start interaction. If it is not pressed, we call stop interaction, and we give it the time seconds. And that's all you need to do. This is how you start or stop interaction. This whole logic can be simplified. You can simply copy those functions, the get time seconds, start and stop, into the event graph in here. And you can simplify the logic by using branch here and simply true or false. And if you only have one component for interactor, you simply can do this. And it's going to work the very same way. So let's take a look at the NPC or the interactable or any interactable object in that case. And that's here. Sorry for jumping back and forth. In your case, the tick function will be disabled. Please keep it disabled. And let's take a look at the interactable component. So here is some debug mode, which will enable this toString function to print something to the text renderer. Is the same logic as in the interactor. And here we have one important thing. As I said in the player, the 4.0 update comes with multiplayer support. But to make everything multiplayer ready, you need to go to the class defaults and in your actor set replicate to true. That will make the NPC multiplayer ready, and it will make everything inside the hold and press components or any other interactable components replicated from server to all clients. So if I go to the hold and scroll down a little bit, you should see in the replication tab that the component replicates is set to true. And even this value gives you the tooltip that owning actor must be replicating first. This is native Unreal Engine logic. So please, if you are doing some multiplayer stuff, always stick everything that's related to interaction to replicate. So let's actually minimize everything what's not important right now, and let's take a look at all the stuff that's inside the interactable component. All data that you can see here might slightly differ from interactable type to other type. So in this case, as you can see, the interaction period is actually a good example, because for the press one, if I try to give it 5 seconds, it's going to automatically change back to -1, because press interaction cannot take any time. So there are some under the hood shenanigans which will handle some default values to be using valid data and valid values. We have actually already discussed a lot of this stuff when I showed you the example and the gameplay, so I think you already understand most of it. This interactable component is actually not doing any work itself. It only basically holds data for the interactor to compare against. So for instance, the hold, as you can see, it requires 3 seconds to finish. So again, I need to set it to a collision channel that is the one I use in the player. There is a cooldown period, lifecycle modes, and everything. I will explain this in a second, don't worry. In the press, I should do the same thing and compile and save. And optional, there is one thing, sorry for this, you need to clear those tags manually, because for some reason the gameplay tags didn't go through the Unreal Engine Marketplace build session. You can always download them, as I said, in the Interactor Component. I will give you the link in the description below. Now let's take a look at those interactable data. So most data will be the same for every single component. So let's take a look at debug. Debug, as you can imagine, enables debug mode. Not really interesting, it simply shows some debug stuff if you're struggling. Now let's take a look at the most important required tab. The interaction period defines how long the interaction itself is going to take. In case of hold, it's going to define how long you need to press the button in order to finish the interaction. Default state works the same way as the default interactor state. With the same exception, you cannot set it to active. If you set it to active, you will get a warning that you are doing something you are not supposed to do. Then we have a setup type. And the setup type is very important thing, because as you can see, the hold component is child of sphere. But we want to highlight the interactable. So if I hit play and go to this interactable, you can see it's been highlighted. So how does the component knows that it's supposed to highlight the skeletal mesh? It knows it because of the setup type. The setup type has multiple values, full auto setup. This value will find all primitive shapes, including collision shapes and mesh shapes, and add all of them to collisions and highlights. The all parents auto setup will do the same, but only for all actors. For all owner components. So in case of the hold, it will add the sphere, skeletal mesh, and capsule components. It will not add anything what's not directly parent or parent's parent, etc. in the hierarchy above the hold. The quick auto setup will only add the first owner, the first parent. This is the default value, but if I set it to this value and go to this NPC, let me quickly go to the hold, and yes, it's set to quick auto setup, and if I hit play, it's going to show the UI, but it will not show the highlight. You can fix this quite easily, because in optional, we have highlightable overrides. So if I specify here a skeletal mesh, and compile and save, and hit play, you can see it's highlighting the skeletal mesh, because I explicitly said, please add this name or tag of a parent or child component to highlightable components. So you can combine different setup types with different highlightable and collision overrides to make everything work as you need. So the collision channel is what actually defines what response this collision, which is being defined by the setup type or collision overrides, is responding with. So if I set trace here, it will set, let's go back to the quick auto setup. If I set trace, it will add to the sphere. It will basically get this collision setup and it will add trace to block. If you assign a wrong collision channel, it might actually break some stuff. For instance, if you have a skeletal mesh in your collision overrides and you add a word dynamic or word static, your skeletal mesh can actually fall through the floor. So please, all the time, make sure you create your own collision channels and you only use those collision channels. Now we have a cooldown period, lifecycle mode, and lifecycle count. Those three values are very closely tied together. Let's start with the lifecycle mode. There are only two options, once or cycles. If you only set it to once, the whole interaction logic from the start to the end will only happen once. After you finish the interaction, it will disable the interactable component completely. You will not be able to start the interaction again. The cycled one, on the other hand, works the way it can be interacted with multiple times. For instance, an NPC in your game. You can interact with the NPC as many times as you want, or you can actually specify the lifecycle count. So if you set the lifecycle count, for instance, to 3, after third interaction, the component will again be disabled and you won't be able to interact again. And the cooldown period is how much time it takes between the life cycles, between finished interaction, how long it takes after we finish interaction to enable the interaction once again. sorry for jumping into that this way. If you go to events, there are actually two different events. One is for interaction finished. Here is lifecycle completed, which is being called once you finish one lifecycle. And there is another event on it's interaction completed. So if you complete the interaction, it's going to be called every single time, but only if you have the mode set to once, or once is the last final life cycle. If you have multiple life cycles, it's going to always call the cycle completed. So there are two different events that could be used for the same thing, depending on your setup. Now let's go back to the values of the interactable, and I will explain you what is the interaction weight. The interaction weight defines how important this interactable is. Default value is 1, but if I set this hold to 1 and this press, for instance, to 4, and let me quickly get it to quick auto setup here. So the press is 4 and hold is 1. So if I hit play, hopefully you should be able to see different thing in here. So let me quickly unpossess and select the NPC. The hold has actually set the interaction weight 10, so let's give it to 1. And as you can see, a new UI spawned called press. Because the press have different interaction weight. So let's do it the correct way. Let's not override stuff in runtime. And let's give this 1 and delete all this unnecessary stuff here and keep the press on 4. So if I hit play now, you should be able to see the press here. And the press is not using the interaction override, the highlight overrides, as you can see. That's why it's not highlighting everything. That's why it only shows UI. So using the interaction weight, you can actually define what interactions are more important inside the same actor. Or, let me quickly show you something. If I quickly duplicate this actor here and make them very close and set this press to, let's say, 10, it will show you, if I F8, it will show you that only this, actually, let me go back to the character to visualize the debug a little better, so you can actually see what is happening on the screen. So if I hit play, you can see I have hit multiple actors. I have hit this first one here, and I have hit the second one in here. But I chose the press one, which is this one, because it has much higher interaction weight. So you can actually define the importance of interactables, not just within the one actor, but also compared to other actors. So if you have two NPCs next to each other, or you have, for instance, a chest and a key inside, if you set the chest weight interaction to a higher number, you will always interact with the chest first, and it will not allow the key to be interacted with until the chest has been interacted with. So let's go back to the NPC and let's take a look at the weight. So if you hover over it, you will get the useful pop-up information, which explains the details. And now we are getting to stuff that you already know from the previous versions, and that's the optional things. Gameplay text, that's actually something new, but it's the same thing that I've already explained before. There's just a list of gameplay text that the player can be compared against. Ignored classes defines what classes cannot even ever interact with this interactable. Collision overrides enables you to specify what mesh, you will be using a collision override. The same applies to highlights. It's just for highlights. Then you have to specify your highlight type. It's whether it's using post-processing material or overlay material. The post-processing logic is basically deprecated at this point because we have the overlay material, which is native to Unreal Engine, and it is recommended to use for most of the cases. The post-processing material requires the post-process volume to be in the level, and it has slightly different and more tougher setup. So let's use the overlay material anywhere as you need. Then you can specify whether the interaction highlight is enabled or not. If it's not enabled, it will never highlight the mesh. Then, if you have overlay material, you should specify your material. Default value is this noisy one. If you click on the Navigate To button, it will navigate you to the folder, which is inside the plugin. So you can actually add it here, and you can see that it is using some Fresnel function to highlight only stuff that's on edge. There are multiple other materials in here. One is glowing. You can see it has some slight glowing to it. We have very simple, just static highlight. You don't need to use these. You can make your own. These are here just as examples. Then we have ability to persist. And this is slightly experimental feature because it enables the interaction progress. If you, let's say you have a hold component and you press the button for 2 seconds of free, and then you release it. If it can persist, then based on the expiration value, it will keep the interaction progress until you hit the button again. I can't really imagine a real life example for this, but I assume that there might be some cases for you that will make sense. So feel free to experiment with these values. Then another option is interactable data. And again, it comes with the plugin. It's a data table with some example. In this case, it's only one example value, and it is using custom structure. You can make your own. You don't really need to have this data table. It is predefined here because it in the project settings. If you scroll down to the interaction system, and here is the default data table. Those data tables are used to hold all the interaction data. You can specify textures, you can specify custom descriptions, you can specify names, you can specify anything there. And you can load those data into interaction widgets. This is just a simple and easy way how to manage multiple data in a way which is data friendly. And the last thing is the interactable name, and that's just the name of the interactable component. It's actually the name of the action it represents. In this case, this one represents hold, the press represents press. And that's basically all there is for interactable and interactor in terms of what values you can set up. Let's quickly take a look at the configuration, and then I will show you how to actually add your own component to any actor. Let's go back to the project settings, to the interaction system, and here is custom config file. In here, there are defaults for interactor and for interactable. As you can see, some stuff is predefined. You can actually change almost everything. So for instance, the safety tracing setup is set to location with camera safety channel. If you set it to none, stuff becomes not editable. If you set it to socket, it will enable you to specify the mesh name and the socket name. Then default state, default collision channel, and this is not that important because there is no logic behind the scenes which sets those data to the interactor, unless you call a function called setDefaults for the interactor. But for the interactable, it is more tricky. I will quickly show you what I mean, okay? Let's go to the MPC and let's scroll down to Mountea section. And here are your components. So if I add mesh component, you can see I have some stuff already predefined, like the material, the data table with no row name though. I have the collision channel, I have the setup type, etc., etc. So let me quickly delete this and go back to the configuration. This configuration is what defines and what is used every single time you add a new component. So if you want to make your life easier and you know you are going to reuse those settings in almost every single interactable, set those in the config file, hit save, and every single time you add a new component, it will set those data as defaults for you. But if you actually added some components, for instance, this press component, and you want to override stuff you made, for instance, you broke something and you have no idea what happened, you can always click the button Set Default Values. And as you can see, if I hit again, it sets default values back again from the configuration file from the project settings. So this is a very useful tool if you have instances in the level that you broke or you want to get back to defaults. Just hit the button and it will update that component based on this configuration file in your project settings. Okay, now let's minimize this and let's go to the most confusing part of this tutorial, and that's mapping keys. This plugin comes with two mapping keys predefined for you. That's the F key on the keyboard and gamepad face button on the gamepad. Let me open the F key. And the mapping keys actually contain key pairs. So here we define the texture for this key. Those textures again, if I go to the project, you can see that I have included some textures with the plugin. Feel free to use those. And it defines supported device type, so mouse and keyboard. That means the F key is only supported and will only be shown for the mouse and key input device. If you want to show those values, this texture and this value filter out further, you can specify for what platforms it is enabled. I mean, mouse and keyboard makes sense to enable on all desktop platforms, but for gamepad, it's going to be a little bit more tricky. So let's take a look at that. So here is a gamepad, which supported device type is gamepad, and this is Xbox texture. Let me show you, let me minimize the F key, and as you can see here, we have the PlayStation texture. And we are supporting the same platforms. So we are supporting with the Xbox texture, the Windows, Linux, Mac, and Xbox Series X platform. But we also want to have the ability to show if you have two gamepads, and if you want to use your PlayStation gamepad on your PC, you want to see the correct icon. So this way, you can actually specify what device IDs are being blacklisted by specific texture. So if I use gamepad, which is Xbox gamepad, is going to have device ID of X input controller. So if I have different gamepad, which has, for instance, device ID of DualSense, it will take a look at this configuration, if it's DualSense, for instance, on Windows, and will be taking a look at this configuration, and it will hit this row and it will be like, okay, I'm not allowed, so I will not use this texture. then it goes to different configuration, and here it will realize, hey, I am enabled, so I will use this texture. How does it work in action? Let me quickly show you on this example. Let me delete this annoying extra one. And let's actually make the hold higher interaction weight than the press because the hold is already set up. And let me hit play. And as you can see, there is F key button behind the hold, behind wall. This is the name of the NPC in the UI. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to connect my controller and move it. As you can see on the right side, new device has been connected. And if I move the controller, the icon has changed. Now I'm going to move my mouse and the icon has changed again. You can dynamically swap textures based on the input device and input device ID. Just please keep in mind that not all widgets support this logic. So this one actually does because it has the texture inside. But if I'm about to use this one and hit play again, now I'm using mouse and keyboard. As you can see, there is some glowing stuff above the NPC head. Now I'm about to use gamepad. As you can see, nothing has changed. And that's because not all widgets have the same logic. So widgets which don't have any input texture, there is nothing to be happening inside of them. So just keep this in mind. Okay, so how do you actually make it work out of the box? That's, I guess, the most important question for you. So let's go. So in content folder, let's create a new blueprint, an actor, BP interaction actor. Let's move him here somewhere. Let's give him a very simple static mesh. Something what actually that would work. And let's add Interactable Component. In the Mountea section, there are multiple components. Let's use the hold one, for instance. As you can see, there are some stuff predefined. Let's use the trace option. Quick auto setup is completely fine. And let's actually compile and save. Let's minimize it. And let's hit play. And as you can see, just like this, we made it work with this custom actor. This simple it is to make it work. And if I hold the interaction, if I hold it long enough, it's going to be finished. Now it is finished, and now the cooldown has expired, and now we can interact again. So yeah, you can't see the highlight because of its flat surface. Don't worry, it works, as you can see from other angles. So this is how easy it is to set up the interactable actor if you have your project settings and your player already set up. Now, the last thing, how to make it work in multiplayer. Well, you can actually simulate the multiplayer in editor easily. Scroll down to net mode and play as client. Now, if I hit play, I'm a client. Now I have some extra. You can see it's been a little bit laggy behind me because the tracing happens on server side. So it's server authoritative because we don't really want players to be authority over what is being traced against. And if I go here again, as you can see, everything works out of the box because the interactable actor here is set to replicate. And the player himself is set to replicate too. So you don't actually need to do anything in order to make it work in multiplayer. Okay, so this is way too long video showcasing the interaction plugin with the new updates. And let me quickly go over them again. In the project settings, in the Mountea Framework, in the interaction, you need to specify config file. You need to specify default widget class. You should specify the interaction data table, and you should specify the interaction input mapping. It is highly recommended to use the example character from the plugin examples folder, and to get rid of those annoying errors, I highly suggest, well, it's mandatory to add feature or content tag third person. If you add it, it's going to work out of the box. Then you need to open the example character. You need to go to the begin play, and this mapping is what breaks the blueprint. For some of you, simply browse to the input mapping, move it somewhere, for instance, to your project folder, and then you can relay the third person. Then again, in the example, there is a player and there is NPC. And you don't need to, but you should use those as your base classes. The character is the player, and this character contains the onTraced, which updates the tracing start, and it contains the process input action, which is responsible for the inputs like starting and finishing the interaction. If you open it, there is this logic here. The start or stop interaction with this validation check can interact, and the optional consume input logic here. The NPC is not mandatory to use because we have seen that it's super simple to set it up for different actors, but the NPC is the easiest thing you can think of. It's just a component which is set to use the sphere as collision and the skeletal mesh as highlight. So this is the overview of the new update, which comes with multiplayer support. If you have any further questions, feel free to join the support Discord, which is in the description down below. And if you have any suggestions, issues, bugs, or you just want to go there and chat with us, feel free to join, and see you next time. Bye.